Welcome to Dastardly Cleverness in the Service of Good. I'm Spencer Critchley.
Hi, I'm Kevin Lewis.
And I'm Zach Friend.
Good to see you guys, as always. As we talk today, the House Speaker's chair has been vacated for the first time in history. Many people would say it's been vacant since about February when Kevin McCarthy first sat down in it. And I think that if Kevin McCarthy has offered us nothing else, he's offered us some kind of lessons in leadership. I wonder what we think about that as a group. Kevin, how does it look to you?
Well, I think it's really important, especially in politics and national politics, that you learn how to negotiate, communicate, and compromise. And when we're talking about the well-being of the American people on the line, you really can't negotiate with folks who don't really want to do what's right and do what's necessary. You also can't really lead with a knife at your throat. And if you need 15 different votes to get elected to do anything, I think he probably should. That was already the red flag, right? It took him 15 votes to get elected and just one to get booted. So I don't know. I think that definitely put a damper on his style.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good phrase. 15 to get elected, one to get booted. Zach, how about you?
I think that the broader question here is whether the House is governable and whether the Republican Party actually can govern. I mean, irrespective of whether it's Kevin McCarthy or any of the other players that are now currently seeking the post, I think to Kevin's point, the deals with the devil that you have to make are going to come to roost at some point. And the question is ultimately, ostensibly, they're there to govern. And it doesn't seem as though it's maybe a governable path at all. I mean, if a lot of this is kind of junior high-ish, right? There's a lot of infighting that seems to be personality driven, and it could be a little bit about our media ecosystem that rewards this kind of behavior more than it actually rewards policy wins. But from a country and a democracy perspective, which I think is the more important or broader question, whether it was former Speaker McCarthy or any other player within the Republican Party, the question is really, can they actually govern? Do they want to govern? Is creating the chaos part of the plan? Is getting the country to be so dissatisfied with our elected leaders part of a plan of success from an electoral standpoint? I don't really know, but I can tell you this, they are succeeding more at chaos than they are at governing. And it's unclear what the path is moving forward from them from a democracy standpoint.
I think it's actually a real possibility. And I think that amongst some of the extremists, at least, and let's remember the extremists are running the party, whether it's the clown caucus in the House or the fact that the head of the party is actively trying to overthrow democracy. I think that's actually a legitimate question that, the chaos may be the point. The point is to prove that government just does not work. And so it's a win. The worse it looks for some of the most extreme people, it's a win. And how about the contrast between Kevin McCarthy as House leader and Hakeem Jeffries in his brief tenure, or Nancy Pelosi for that matter?
So, I mean, We're seeing this play out right before our eyes and live. I think you saw Hakeem Jeffries gather his caucus, get everyone on the same page. Everyone's marching from using the same playbook, and they didn't divert. And I think that's what you see in real leadership. And I think the way that you do that is you build trust, you set a vision, and you set a plan. And I think that Democrats saw that Hakeem Jeffries was the real deal from day one. He's a tough guy. He's from Brooklyn. I'm from Brooklyn, so I'm a little partial. But I think that he was able to really galvanize, the troops and have everyone just stick with the plan. And right now, what you're seeing with Republicans is just, they just can't. They have like the third highest ranking position in the entire country. You can complain about Joe Biden. They can complain about, Vice President Kamala Harris. They have an extremely powerful position, and they couldn't do anything. And I witnessed this, and I experienced this back in my Obama years when I was working in the White House. They are really good at being against something. They can fire up their base against something. They create these boogeymen and they create these villains. A lot of times, a lot of the folks who they're talking to don't even know where these places are. When you think about Benghazi and all the other villains, the different members of the president's cabinet, they don't even know them. They just know that they're not supposed to like them. And they realize, like, hey, we don't need to be for anything. We can just be against something. And that's where they thrived over and over and over again. But that's not how anyone thrives. That's not how the country is going to thrive. You need to stand for something. You need to have a vision. And they just seem to lack that.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. I mean, I agree about Hakeem Jeffries. I just think he's been so impressive right from the beginning at, not just knowing his job, but just projecting leadership, which is something that Democrats, I think, have been generally bad at it in the past, with exceptions, like Obama, for example, is a really notable exception. Zach, what do you think?
Well, I'll answer your question with a question, like a real communications professional, Spencer. And so my question for you is, do you think the Democrats did the right thing by voting en masse and en bloc to boot the speaker? Because in some respects, what you're seeing is, to Kevin's point here, I mean, Hakeem showed that he can, as disparate in many respects as the Republican caucus from an ideological standpoint, but yet was able to align in complete alignment, which to me shows that they could govern if they were given the power to govern again, as far as the House goes, in a unified way. But Spencer, what are your thoughts on whether that was the right decision for Democrats to be unified? And
I think it was the right decision. Leading into it, frankly, I was wondering, are they going to do some, voting present and bail out Kevin McCarthy? And I was actually really glad to see that, nope, Hakeem Jeffries, Nancy Pelosi, and others just said no, and not just to be spiteful or to stick it to him, but to just recognize the reality. Another thing that Democrats have fallen victim to all too often, and I was worried they were going to do it this time, is to be so unused to the idea of just straightforwardly standing up and fighting for what you believe in and for what's right, aside from whatever your partisan position is. Just too many Democrats have just lost the I think, direct personal experience of what it feels like to do that, but obviously not Hakeem Jeffries. And the point being here, Kevin McCarthy is not better than Matt Gaetz in terms of having any kind of principle, any kind of trustworthiness. They're just two different varieties of the same thing. And as has been pointed out, McCarthy, with that incredible betrayal of democracy right after January 6th, where first of all, he stands up against the attempt to overthrow our government, because obviously he felt like that's the way the political winds were blowing at that moment. And then the moment that felt a little hot, down he goes to Mar-a-Lago to beg forgiveness. So yeah, I think that was the right decision. And, I'd like to talk about this aspect too, because I think the three of us, with our experience in communications from various perspectives, can talk about this in a way that maybe some other folks might not be familiar with. But what makes somebody like a Hakeem Jeffries or a Nancy Pelosi a strong leader is not that they have got some complicated leadership formula or, some special kind of expertise. It's more about understanding how to use and project power and authority. And a lot of that is nonverbal. So a lot of what makes Hakeem Jeffries powerful, I'm sure he has, there's all kinds of detailed discussions going on behind the scenes that we don't get to see, but a lot of what makes him powerful as a leader, as far as the public does see, is it comes down to things like the way he stands and looks at the camera and his tone of his voice when he's delivering a message. And you can just tell this guy is confident, he knows what he stands for, and he means business. And that's something Democrats have been slow to learn. But I think some of them, like Hakeem Jeffries, have learned that lesson. But I'd love to hear the perspectives of both of you from that point of view.
Spencer, I want to take a step back before I get into that question, because something else that's very important when it comes to leadership is the transition of power. And I remember, closing out the Obama administration, a lot of Democrats wanted President Obama to be more present. And I remember talking to him and him saying that, he needed to take a step back in order to create the space for other leaders to step in and do the job. Because if everyone's looking to him to lead, especially when he's no longer a leader of the country, no longer president of the country, that will cause a lot of confusion, and it'll prevent the next leader from being able to step in, or next leaders from being able to step in. So he takes a step back. Nancy Pelosi is there. At that point, President Trump was just elected, and he's coming in. And wow, what an immense challenge that was for Nancy Pelosi to lead the Democrats and lead the country, because really the White House wasn't really leading the country. They won the election, but they lacked in leadership. And she stepped in. And she also, put a date on herself and said, hey, it is time for some young blood and new, fresh ideas and fresh thoughts within the party to step in. And I'm going to step down at the appropriate time. And she held to it. Hakeem Jeffries stepped in. And man, again, at a very difficult time. And he's showing immense leadership. Yeah, it's about how he presents himself and what he says. But it's also transition of power between individuals who have like ideologies, but not holding on to power for so long where you're not investing in that next generation. I think that's so important. And I thought we're seeing Democrats do that in a very powerful way.
Very powerful point that you're raising, and maybe the subtext of that is the contrast that we saw within the Republican Party, right? There is no transfer of power within the House. There is no transfer of power within the leadership post the Trump presidency. So to my earlier point or question about whether it's governable, I mean, do you feel that the Republican Party under its current construct can have this sense of a peaceful transfer even within itself, which I think is a predicate to being able to do it on a broader side, on the democracy side, which is a question that I know that Spencer is constantly asking, on this podcast. But I mean, it's, to me, are we in a situation where all of the incentives for one of the political parties are such that make it that governance and transfer of power and fundamental precepts of American democracy are not rewarded? I'm not going to say valued, because different people have different values or how they perceive the situation, but they're not rewarded. I mean, is that what you are observing?
I think what I'm seeing, what I'm experiencing, I think, what the country's experiencing is a lack of political courage. And it's something that I've seen creep up time and time again, where someone needs to do the right thing and they're more concerned with keeping their job. And, right thing is relative, where I would I don't know, do I need to give Kevin McCarthy credit for not wanting the country to default on its bills? Like I thought about that just now. I was like, well, I want to give him credit for at least keeping the country open and keeping government open and making sure that we pay our bills. Like, that's the least of it. I have a mortgage. I pay my bills. Wow. Pat on the back. Like, that's what you're supposed to do. Right? Real leadership is taking us further. We're still stuck with these old things, and they need to really, I'm going down a rabbit hole. To answer your question on whether I think it's governable, I think in the current state of the Republican Party, I really don't see a path for them. And I'm pretty down the middle. I try to see, the perspective from the other side when I can, and it's really hard. When you're telling me that, hey, I need to negotiate between, feeding starving families and paying our bills, and that's what you want to cut. I don't know how that makes any sense, especially if, several folks on the far right want to say, want to talk about, Christian values. And we're talking about, immigration, folks at the border. All these things are things that Christians would care about. I'm a Christian. I care about these things. I want to, I just find it really different. And it shouldn't matter whether you're a Christian or not. These are just basic human things that you should care about, and wanting to make sure that folks have the right to a great education, and not rewriting history. It's not. Anyways, I am going down that.
No, I think
to answer your question, I don't think it's tenable, and I want to get Spencer in here to give
No,
his
no,
thoughts as
I
well.
don't think it's a rabbit hole. I actually wanted to talk about the moral dimension of this because I think it's another area that in politics people don't talk about enough, and people don't know how to talk about it, especially if they're your sort of typical kind of liberal elites. The sort of college-educated liberals are extremely uncomfortable talking about things like Christianity or any kind of moral code for fear of violating the First Amendment, or sometimes, frankly, I actually think it's for fear of not looking cool, because it's not cool to be religious in some circles. And I think that obviously Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, atheism, frankly, share common moral values when it comes down to do we think that children should suffer? And the answer is no. Do we think kindness is better than cruelty? And the answer is yes. Do we think honesty is better than lying? And the answer is yes. And that's true in all cultures around the world. And one of the signs of being a savvy journalist or a savvy commentator, unfortunately, is thinking all of that is beneath you in some sense, that it's sentimental, because you've been to college, you understand concepts like moral relativism, and you understand the problems that arise when anybody tries to impose their moral code on other people. But the fact is, in my view, democracy remains at bottom a moral enterprise because we agree that everybody has equal rights. We believe in freedom. We believe in the rule of law. We believe in democratic self-government. We believe in resolving differences nonviolently. We can't logically prove that those are the correct ways to think ultimately. But we start out by agreeing that, we agree that those are going to be bedrock values. So you can be a member of any religion you like. You can be a member of no religion. You've got huge freedom to do and think and say what you want until you use violence to resolve your disputes, or until you're flagrantly lying and acting in bad faith. And those are where, those are the places where we draw the line. So I actually would like to pursue that rabbit hole a little bit more, because one of the lessons from Kevin McCarthy is that his obvious lack of principles, I'm sure he thinks it's smart. And there are a lot of people who think, oh, look how clever we are. And look at what Donald Trump is getting away with, which seems to prove the case for the cynic, right? That nothing matters, LOL, as people will actually say these days. Some folks in the consultant class will actually say nothing matters, LOL. And yet, it's like the Greeks used to say, character is destiny. At a certain point, it does catch up with you. So, and when you see a Hakeem Jeffries or a Nancy Pelosi, I have no doubt I don't know either of them personally, but I have no doubt they are very sophisticated political operatives. And at the same time, I have no doubt they actually stand for things. And that's not just the morally right way to go, in my view. It's the smart way to go. It might take a while, but in the long run, it ends up working better, like it did for Obama, for example. And like I think, frankly, it works for Joe Biden. He actually does stand for some stuff, and it actually ends up making a difference. So Zach, what do you think about that? As an elected official who has to deal with the realities of politics on the ground day after day, does that make your eyes roll, or do you think it's true?
Well, I'm too old to know what LOL means. I'll tell you that right now, Spencer.
Oh man, I thought I was keeping up.
You were trying. I know this was Spencer's pathetic attempt to reach younger people. Here.
Oh man,
pretty soon he's gonna be talking about Snapchat and TikTok. I mean, he's not. Trust me, he's got no idea. Yeah, well, we'll just. Luckily, we can edit this entire section out of this.
Yeah, podcast. No one will ever know.
So, well, I think that. No. So I think that I was actually going to talk about being an elected official, because I think that I'm living in a very interesting environment where I can't what it is to have a constituent tell me how they hate the extremes. They're losing faith on the national level. They actually, it's interesting, they reinvest in the local level, which is to me a very interesting tell of what happens when you develop a personal relationship with somebody, or to Kevin's earlier point about leadership and compromise. And because if there's only a couple of you casting votes and you see them at the grocery store, it's a very different experience than when you're going on Fox News or CNN or whatever, and you get to say whatever bombast makes you feel good and you get some extra mentions online. But I don't know, what's interesting is that people tell me this, but then I don't know that they really act that way. I mean, meaning that the incentives for an elected official right now in my space are you get rewarded more for expediency. So for example, you get rewarded for filling a pothole than giving the space to find a way to fund the entire road. So there's no incentive for any kind of long-term policy planning at all. And two, you're not rewarded for just sort of steering the ship down what I think anybody would consider a reasonable or well-representative path, because the way that you get noticed is by taking a position that's on top of a position that's to a pretty far extreme. So what I think would have been, when I first got elected 11 years ago, something that no one would have really stepped out and did, now I'm finding are really common within my space, where people are taking pretty large extreme position, even if they don't actually agree with it. I mean, it's just sort of as a starting point, and seeing where it sticks. And you get the LA Times, they cover your position, or the San Francisco Chronicle or the Washington Post, and that's the win, right? But to make this even finer point, though, that's how you get the Democratic or Republican Party support in order to become a statewide office holder. That's how you get a national profile. And so even if your values are aligned on sort of the right way politically, the way that you gain the political power in this current structure is very difficult, Spencer. I mean, you actually have to take positions that I think make it harder and harder to govern. And my sense is that when one side, and what we're seeing and playing out at the House, how does that impact then the side that still wants to govern? Because the incentives are aligned to just counteract that by any means necessary. And I would argue that actually benefits the Republican side more by playing into that sort of trench warfare, because you should stand up for what you believe and you should draw the lines, but then if you play the same game. But I think that's what's the challenge. Look, the last 4 years have been the largest number of retirements of elected officials across the country. I mean, COVID had a big part to do with it, and people protesting outside of people's houses over vaccines and stuff. But I think it's also just the way that there's interactions and expectations from community members and their elected officials today. And if you're growing up in that environment, basically the Bronx and Brooklyn of politics across the country, like where you're in this, everything is a fight, and you're trying to differentiate on the fight, I don't know how that plays for us long term, but this is what I'm experiencing. I see it, but what's fascinating is the disconnect between the constituents saying they don't want that, but then rewarding it at the ballot box, right? And that's something I don't know how to solve. But Kevin, to me, I was thinking about what you're saying about how the Republicans are playing it, and I'm thinking, well, even at the local level, I'm seeing this. Even though somebody would look in the mirror and say, I'm not like that.
So what is the path forward? Because it sounds right now I'm hearing a lot of doom and gloom. Republicans happen to have the majority in the House right now. But right now the country doesn't have a speaker. And we obviously have a lot of big things that we need to get done. And I'm just curious to know your thoughts on, as an elected official and experiencing what you're experiencing at the local level, like how do you think we move forward?
I think there are three things that can and would have to change in order to fundamentally shift this. One is the media ecosystem is designed and rewarded right now in a way of pure self-selection bias. And if I don't want to ever experience anything other than somebody that agrees with me, I can do that right now, right? So I think that I was hoping that the Dominion loss, I was hoping that there would be some challenges to the current ecosystem that would require us to have a commonality of understanding, because right now, Kevin, we're not operating on a national side on a common set of facts. And that actually really matters. I mean, you could have two people at the same press conference and the coverage is like astonishingly different. But I think that the way forward is coming to some common set of fact. You can disagree on the approach from the facts, but if we're not even having the same baseline, I think that that's number one. Number two, I think that there needs to be better recruitment of real people into local elected offices, because they are the seat. First off, it makes we focus on the House and we focus on the presidency, but I got to tell you, a lot more of your life's decisions are made by city councils, mayors, boards of supervisors, governors, school board members, etc., right? Where the barrier to the election is significantly lower. And then a number of those folks go to federal office, right? And what we have now are a lot of federal folks that have never served in any office at all, but they were able to get on local TV over some extreme issue. If you look, we're at a historic low of numbers of people at the federal level that served in a local office, and I think that there is a real value in having that grocery store encounter that I'm referencing. But what I'm hearing, and I'd announced that I'm not running for a fourth term actually in my seat, and in conversations with folks that would be potentially good for the seat. There are people that are running that would be good for the seat, but they said that there was no way I would get involved in that world. I mean, because they don't want to go through what they've seen me go through, or people are protesting outside your house. They don't want to be a part of a national narrative where everything's polarized and negative, even if it's not as much at the local level. And so I think we have to really foster an environment where people want to run for local offices and can see that it really is an honorable profession, as my former colleague Ryan Coonerty used to say, which is that public service is still an honorable goal. I mean, I don't think that that's the case. And the third precept of that is that when it comes to education, I mean, I've got an 8-year-old. I mean, there's a lot of kids associated with this podcast. And, they don't even, literally, they do not teach anything that would have any sort of understanding about local government or civics in a traditional way. He kind of knows what I do. I mean, this is literally like he lives with me and he still doesn't know what it is I do. I mean, so there has to be, it's easy to other something if you have no education or information about it, right? And so there has to be a reinvestment of an understanding of the civic process, how to vote, what your local government does, what the federal government does, and not just one quarter semester in fourth grade, not just one, where they're studying here in California history and government, not just one semester or quarter in high school where you study U.S. government. I mean, that doesn't cut it, right? So I would say the media, the local recruitment, and the educational thing, these are huge, I understand, but I think that the erosion of those three things, Kevin, are pretty significant in order to change this around.
I'm really sorry to hear that you're not running again. I did not know that. I think what's concerning for me is the type of elected officials who are starting to leave on both sides. And when you have folks who are less centrist on the Republican side, and on the Democratic side, just folks whose hearts are in it and they're doing it for all the right reasons, begin to leave those positions of public service. It is heartbreaking, because we need those folks in positions of power because they're doing it for the right reasons, and there's some of the best people to get things done. More amenable to compromise. Compromise is not a bad thing. I wish I can get everything that I want. I can't. I have my own 7-year-old to worry about here, right? Like he has thoughts and ideas. My 2-year-old has more thoughts than him. My wife has thoughts about what I'm doing right now. Everyone has thoughts. But the way that you get things done at a when you talk about local level, you talk about community, but at a super local level within my own home, I think compromise is needed. And when you have those folks who were willing to compromise, no longer serving in public service, I think that's just it's a very dangerous thing. And the other institutions that you were talking about, as far as like how we push forward, it is going to take a whole heck of a lot for those things to change. So anyways, but Spencer, I think you've written a couple books on this. Like I'm curious to know like what your thoughts are as well.
Well, I've managed to produce one book, and the second one is taking a little longer because I think it's going to end up being 4 or 5 books in one if I don't watch it. But yeah, I mean, what we're talking about here is kind of at the heart of a lot of what I'm talking about, because the first book is about Patriots of Two Nations, as people might get a hint about from my background here, is about the idea that there have been 2 entirely different pictures of what the nation is from the founding, and that led to the Civil War. It led to Trumpism. It's not just racism. It's easy to just say, well, these people are just white nationalists. It's certainly a lot of it. I sometimes think if someone said, look, if you have 2 choices, is this a white nationalist cake with some frosting on it or some other kind of cake? It's a white nationalist cake, basically. But that's not the whole story. The whole story is bigger than that. And there are people who support Trump who, I think by now you can't support Trump without being a racist and a bigot of all different kinds, even through choosing to be ignorant. But there are people who got into supporting Trump who were sure they were not racists or bigots, and who thought what they were responding to was a moral call, a call to a moral crusade. And you still hear people now, as deluded as I think they are, who make these arguments for these insane ideas, in my view, like, Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism or whatever it is, which they've convinced themselves are moral crusades. And then the moral crusade gives you the excuse to indulge in all kinds of horribly immoral behavior as it happens. But the important point there is that there is a hunger for morality, and people will often choose the really degraded imitation of morality, like somebody like Trump, who seems so obviously a fraud, if they're offered nothing in return. It's kind of a variation of what Bill Clinton famously said, where people will choose strong and wrong over weak and right. And I think actually if you picture that as a stack of options, the top of that stack is strong and right. Not necessarily that you are absolutely factually right, that you can prove you're correct, which you can't. But strong and standing for what you honestly believe in your heart is right, that's the strongest position to be in. It's hard for people to believe that, especially for cynics to believe that. But that's the strength of an Obama, for example. He actually believed in what he was doing. Then below that is strong and wrong, and that's where the current Republican Party basically is operating all the time. And then below that is weak and right. And unfortunately, that's where Democrats have too often functioned. They focus on getting policy right, but they come across as weak, with the exceptions we've been discussing, like Hakeem Jeffries, for example. And then at the bottom of that 4-part stack is weak and wrong. But I think what we need to recognize is that Democrats and liberals in general, since about the 60s, in my view, when they all started sending their kids to college, have become very meritocratic and very intellectual, and have lost sight of the fact that ultimately it's a moral enterprise here. And it does not mean you have to imitate the other side and say, well, that's because we need to be a Christian nation, or some other kind of moral code has to rule everybody. No, but there has to be a heart and a soul in it. And even if we get to teaching civics, which I wholeheartedly agree with, we have to go back to making that central to an education. And education was, at the founding, was supposed to be to prepare us to be free citizens, and that got thrown out the window early on. I agree with that, but you have to also take it from the point of view of not just this is technically how it all works, which is the way it's usually taught now and which is extremely boring to most people. You have to talk to them about why this matters and why it's an exciting and inspiring mission that we're all on together, So I sort of typically long answer for me, but I actually think that this is the stuff that gets skated over that's crucially important, and I think we share that experience. Like when I first met Kevin, actually it was because Zach suggested to me I should join the Obama campaign and gave me the introductions that made that happen. And then I eventually met you, Kevin. And when I went to join that campaign on the plane on the way to Philadelphia at that point, I was thinking, I was so impressed with Obama. I was all in on him, but I was thinking, oh God, once I get inside, please don't let me find out that this is all bull. Please. And it wasn't, it obviously wasn't. And I know it's not for you guys. We both have seen enough that we could be cynics if we wanted to be. And sometimes I know all three of us has felt like maybe despair is the only answer. But I think we all appreciate that ultimately you have to stand for something. And when you do, it's not just that you sleep well at night, but it actually turns out to be the smart thing to do. But I want to open that up. Do you think this is all just rainbows and unicorns, or how do you look at it? Kev?
There's some irony to the public service being boring. The irony is, I can't. My son the other day, we were driving him to an event, and he says, I want to listen to the news. And I really couldn't have him listen to the news because the language is so colorful, and the different, especially if Trump is being quoted in any kind of way, it's like I can't have him listen. And then separate from politics, just like everything else that I see in the news today, it is an R-rated it's an R-rated thing to watch these days. I can't have my 7-year-old watch it, which is unfortunate because he's asking for it. And I was surprised. I was shocked. I was like, yeah, I will bring it on. And I put it on for a little bit. I was like, yeah, we got to find something else. So I've had to do my own research and find kids news and like happy news, and where they break it down and is appropriate language for young people. But I think it's, in addition to that being ironic, I think it's also diabolical that, and I don't want it to be Democrat or Republican right now, but it's, from what I'm seeing state to state, we're seeing local governments attack education. It's like they want to keep people dumb. They don't want them to know the history of this country. And when you understand your own history, you know what to look out for, you know how to prevent it, you have an opportunity to learn from it. And, I actually think that education, though it was a form of freedom, which it is, it's also an opportunity to level the playing field. And when you have folks who are attacking that and taking away those rights, and then not emphasizing the need to educate people about how our system works. I think, I was having a conversation with a friend yesterday, and news alert popped up. Former President Trump is named as being floated around as a potential next speaker. And I had to think about it for a second. I was like, wait, he's not even in elected office. He's not in Congress. How could he possibly be Speaker of the House? And I had to remember, I was like, oh, wait, they could just vote for someone to be Speaker of the House. And that is sort of like the confluence of everything that's wrong with that party right now, right? He didn't create, because of his, and again, like, I don't want it to be like, these zingers, and it's not about attacking his character, but it's about telling it how it is, right? I think it's his own ego who Trump feels that he should be the only one, right? And whether he's doing it to get out of legal trouble or whatever it is, like he didn't create the space for someone else. He lost fair and square. He didn't create the space for someone else to step in and lead. And he's looming over the entire party. Folks who are right-minded or at least centrist on the Republican side they can't breathe and do what they think is the right thing to do, because they are worried about folks showing up at their house. They are worried about people sending threats to their families. And one of the cardinal rules, not too long ago, was to leave families out of it. If you have an issue with me and my policy, let's debate it and let's talk about it. And then let's let the people vote and see where it goes. That's not what's happening now. And it's, And I think it's really concerning, and it's beyond concerning. And it's my hope that, through having the right kind of leadership, I think you mentioned Hakeem Jeffries as someone who's doing a phenomenal job. I think through the right leadership, the hope is that the country or people at the local level, and again, Zach, you know way more than I would on this. I think the hope is that there are enough people who are looking at what's happening and not just voting for what their echo chamber is saying, but seeing that, this entire party is not, like, Republican Party is not representing us well. Like, we are the example. Like, America is the example. The United States is the example. It's supposed to be the example. And what we're seeing now, it's just not. And I think that the hope is, and I think this, I'm thinking this out as I'm talking, because Zach, you brought up some really strong points about just, people are more concerned about the potholes on the street, which I think that's also really important. But I think we need to do both at the same time. And I think where there are opportunities for elected officials to demonstrate their commitment to at the local level and say what they're going to do to, fix communities, but then also on the national level, making sure that, the bigger policies are also getting executed, and having a voting base that's going to support that, I think is going to be very key.
Well, I'll finish on this point, because I think it's something that can be explored even in future discussions. That there was a recent Georgetown Battleground poll that I actually sent over to Spencer about. It talked about approximately 9 in 10 Republicans and almost 6 in 10 Democrats feel that their values are under attack in the country. And what I thought was fascinating about it was the fact that that's the operating environment by which we're being asked to govern, okay, at the local, state, and national level. So if, in my case, we'll say 7 or whatever out of 10 people, I have a Democratic majority, and we run as nonpartisan. So we're not affiliated with a party when we run for the offices of my level in the state of California. But if about 2/3 or more of the people that I'm talking to are starting from a framework where they think that government and society are attacking their values, right? I think that is a space that we at least need to acknowledge. So when you're talking about education and books and, trying to keep people, without the information. But on the counter to that, is that somebody saying, well, my values are under attack. And when your values are under attack, you're willing to take whatever extreme measures they are to reset those values. And it's not defending the actions by any stretch. But I think that I need to accept that is what's happening and understand it in order to reach somebody to get them to understand from a communication standpoint, right? And from a governing standpoint. And what I meant earlier by saying the challenge with that is that you're rewarded as an elected right now for expediency, for filling a pothole versus taking, say, a year to get the funding to fix the road because you would be told you didn't do the job. That disconnect, values are under attack. That requires an immediate, emotional, visceral response, right? And yet, addressing it takes a longitudinal relationship building, common set of value discussion that's more challenging in the current space. I want to find a way to do that bridge, not just in my role, but also in the national work we do. But I think that's a continued conversation we should have about how do you effectively also even communicate in that space if about 7 of 10 people, so we're talking both sides here, right, feel that their values are fundamentally under attack and their values are diametrically opposed, right?
Yeah, I think that is one of those problems where you're not just both sidesing it to say this happens on the left as well as the right. I think currently it's obviously far more dangerous and even violent on the right. But that attitude is very popular on the left as well, growingly popular in recent decades, that my personal values and how I personally feel about something is the ultimate authority. And I sometimes worry that really the trajectory we're on now leads to a nation of 350 million tyrants, each of them ruling an empire of one. And on the left, the way that comes up, even, in academia, there's a lot of serious theorizing about this that goes back through postmodernism and critical theory, through Michel Foucault in the postmodern component of that, for example, where the liberal assumption that there is such a thing as a shared public reality where we agree on what's basically factually true, or even that we agree that we use evidence and logic to try to come to an agreement about what's factually true, and then we respect and debate each other's opinions. That is rejected by quite a lot of theory that's become very popular on the left. And you'll hear people talking about my personal truth, and truth that's rooted in lived experience. And again, this goes through the philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas and goes back to the late 19th century. There's a lot of people who seriously believe that this liberal ideal that we can all be different, and yet we agree to meet in a public sphere where we share a commitment to speaking honestly, respecting the power of facts and logic, and resolving our disagreements by debate and negotiation. That's been obviously abandoned by the MAGA right, but there's actually a not insignificant part of the left that's abandoned that view as well, and sees progress in terms not of negotiation, but of abolishing a corrupt system and starting over. That's, I think, part of what I'm talking about with the loss of the shared moral vision for the country. And to me, that's the biggest crisis we face. And I think we may be out of time to solve that one. But I trust we will be doing this again soon. And I want to thank you both. I think it's been a great discussion, as it always is whenever I talk with either or both of you.
Well, Spencer, it's an honor to be back in with you. And Kevin, always love being with you.
Oh, this is a great discussion. I think that similar to the country probably needing therapy to work through its issues, I felt like this was pretty therapeutic to talk through it as well. Always a pleasure.
Thank you both.